Frontline Conversations, leading the debate since 1984.
We're going to talk today to Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, a French political scientist, indologist, who teaches at Sciences Po. Professor Jaffrelot is an authority on South Asian history and politics, and he has written over 20 books on India and Pakistan and various other parts of South Asia. His most recent book, Gujarat Under Modi, has been just released by Context India, and today we are going to talk to him about this book, the main crux of which is the argument that Narendra Modi's tenure as Chief Minister of Gujarat held certain patterns, not just at the policy level, but also at the recruitment level, at the social conditioning level, that he then later replicated during his 2 terms as Prime Minister of India. So we are very happy to welcome Professor Jaffrelot. First thing which I want to ask you, Professor, is at the beginning of the book, you make it clear that the caste equations as well as the relation to Islam that we observe in Gujarat is very, very different from the same caste relations or the same interface with Islam that North Indians would be familiar with, or people in South Indian states like Tamil Nadu or Karnataka would be familiar with. Could you explain to our audience briefly how this mathematics or how these equations are different in Gujarat, what makes it unique?
Yes, well, each state has its own caste system. Of course, the Indie Belt is more than one state. It's a larger meta region, and therefore it tends to be the reference point. We tend to define the caste system by applying the Indie Belt kind of pattern. But Gujarat is different, definitely. Different, first of all, because certainly Brahmins play a big role, but historically, Vaish, Banyas, have been very influential, very powerful, and therefore have tilted somewhat the caste system in their favor. When I say Banya, by the way, I mean Hindu Banya as well as Jain, because as you know, there are many Jain people in Gujarat. So that's one. The other big difference is we've seen something unique in Gujarat. We've seen the making of a caste coalition. Even more than that, you can say the fusion, the merging of 2 castes or caste groups. One, Rajputs, which were very influential in Kathiawar, in the place we know now as Saurashtra. And another one, the Kolis, who were, if you want, OBCs, lower caste, but very numerous. And in the 40s, we see the convergence of these 2 caste groups, which finally merged to create another group known as the Kshatriyas. And they merged to resist the Patels, to resist the Patidars, who had become very influential in the context of the land reform. So you have a kind of fluidity. This is a reflection of a kind of fluidity that is very important. And it's a reflection also, of course, of caste conflicts. You have the upper caste, you have the Patels, you have the Kshatriyas and the OBCs at large. These are 3 major players. Dalits are not so active in Gujarat, and there is no Ambedkarite movement worth that name today. And Adivasis are also not so well structured. So we've had this kind of mathematics, as you say, arithmetic of caste, and that explains a lot of the Gujarati trajectory in politics, primarily because under the pressure of the Kshatriyas, we gradually saw a demand for reservations that culminated in the 80s in the making of the CAM coalition and reservations implemented by, Mr. Solanki, who played such a major part in Gujarat politics. And in that sense, Gujarat was the first state before Mandal, 10 years before Mandal, to initiate a trajectory that also resulted in a reaction on the Hindutva side, from the Hindutva side. The dialectic between caste politics and Hindutva politics crystallized in Gujarat first.
Right. That is really helpful, Professor. And, during the lead up to the election results that happened just a few days ago, I was reading your book in the week leading up to the results. And when I was reading the portion about how Modi saffronized the police forces and many other institutions in Gujarat, uh, it was all sounding very, very significant because during the same week, the election commission at the center was being accused by the public at large and by the media of favoring the Modi or favoring the Modi government. And
so this is one of them. This pillar, I call it the capture of institutions, and police is the first that has been captured. Of course, in a very specific context. No, this is after the pogrom. So post-pogrom Gujarat was a scene where police played a major role. And it was key for Narendra Modi to make sure that there would be no proper investigation. And the policemen who were likely to investigate, the policemen who had tried to do their job during the pogrom, the professional policemen, were sidelined almost systematically, when those who had played the right game, quote unquote, were promoted. And this is the beginning of a process of politicization of the police that will also find expression in a series of fake encounters. You know, after 2003, between 2003 and 2006, 2007, you have a series of more than a dozen of fake encounters. And the police played a key role, of course, in fake encounters. Someone like Vanzara, for instance, played a key role in this. And the idea was the same. The idea was to polarize. By the way, polarization is the first pillar of this system. To polarize by other means. You accuse young Muslims to come from Pakistan or to be trained by jihadi groups based in Pakistan to assassinate the chief minister, and you eliminate them. Sorabuddin is one of them. There are many others, and give a press conference saying, "Well, we have saved the prime minister, the chief minister, from an attack, and here are the guilty men, and we had to kill them because they were running away or whatever." So the police played a big role there. As you may remember, something like 20 policemen were sent to jail because of these practices, including Vanzara. And this is one symptom of how police had been captured by the government. Don't forget that at that time, the Minister of State for Home is Amit Shah himself.
You know, you mentioned that the caste politics of Gujarat is very different from the other states. And during the beginning of the book, you mentioned how there has always been a historical trend of the upper castes in Gujarat intermarrying with intermediate castes in large numbers. And yet there is also this phenomenon of the lower castes, and not just Dalits, but also intermediate castes, actively participating in anti-Muslim pogroms. Even when there is a clear-cut hierarchy, when the treatment of Dalits and specifically with regards to human rights, Gujarat has a terrible record on that. Despite that, they are partaking in Modi's sort of anti-Muslim project, or the anti-Muslim part of his Gujarat model, if you will. How do you explain this sort of superficially, it might look like a contradiction, but as you explain in the book, it's not. So if you could just briefly explain that.
Well, this is, of course, part of the famous dialectic between caste politics and Hindutva politics. The more caste politics asserts itself, the more reservations you have the more radical polarization has to be to precisely diffuse these social tensions. You need more Hindutva for telling the poor, for telling the lower caste people, oh, your main enemy is not the upper caste, your main enemy is the Muslim. So you have to use communalization of society for maintaining social hierarchy, for maintaining the domination of the upper caste. This is exactly what you saw in the 80s when in 1985, a riot that was opposing low caste Hindus and upper caste Hindus, including Patels, was hijacked or was transformed into a riot between Hindus and Muslims. 85 is really a laboratory. At that time, of course, Narendra Modi is organizing secretary of the Gujarat BJP and plays a key role in this. How does that work? Why does it work? Why do Dalits shift from the caste repertoire to the communal repertoire? Well, this is where the work of the Sangh Parivar is so important. Number one, Sanskritization. You make sure that you bring low caste people, Dalits especially, on the right side by working with them at the grassroots level, making them feeling more Hindu and giving them some recognition. Number two, you have, of course, the attraction of looting, of making some money out of communal conflicts. And that's something that was clearly there even before, even in the 69 riot, you have this socioeconomic dimension. You know, Dalit Hindus attacking Muslims because they were accused of taking their jobs in the factories at a time when there was a big problem for the textile mills, cotton mills especially. So there is a socioeconomic dimension that has to be factored in. And third, of course, there is such a lack of unity and political consciousness among low caste actors, players, especially in Gujarat. As I've said, Ambedkarism is very shallow. There is no BSP. There was hardly any RPI. You know, it makes things easier for communal forces.
Professor, I'm just going to slightly backpedal towards one of your earlier books. I believe it was called Hindutva, a Reader. This was in the mid 2000s sometimes. And I had the chance to read that book many years ago. I sort of remember there was a section there in which we talk about the social part of the Hindutva laboratory, not just the legal wing or of influencing institutions like the police force. But if we focus on the social part, I remember there were portions in that book which talked about entities like the Arya Samaj who tried to foment the social unrest by spreading anti-Islam pamphlets. I believe there was one called Rangila Rasool that you spoke about in particular during that book. What was the analogous sort of social part of this lab experiment, if you will, in Gujarat? Or was the Arya Samaj also involved in Gujarat as well?
No, Arya Samaj was not there in Gujarat, even though you may know that Swami Dayanand Saraswati, the founder of Arya Samaj, was a Gujarati.
Yes, I went to a DAV school myself in childhood, so all of this was force-fed to me.
So you know the story. Interestingly, Arya Samaj did not make any inroad in Gujarat. In Gujarat, the really strong Hindu religious movement was the Swaminarayan. Swaminarayan temples are the largest temples in Gujarat these days, for instance, and they have attracted Patels in very large numbers. So it's a different story, but and it's a different story also from the point of view you raise, that is a social dimension. Because Arya Samaj was somewhat a reformist movement, helping the plebeians to get some recognition. The Shuddhi movement, for instance, that they initiated, was a way to bring Dalits in the mainstream of Hinduism. Well, you find that in the Hindutva movement in Gujarat, but with an attempt at keeping the social hierarchy that is much more assertive. Hindutva as a subtext, social status quo. And that's not something so clear on the Arya Samaji side, where social reform was more important. But social status quo in the case of Gujarat was something Patels valued a lot. Patels, remember, were on the Congress side for decades. Vallabhbhai Patel
From the
being,
60s to the 90s.
Exactly. And then they shifted. And they shifted in the 90s because of the anti-reservation movement they wanted to be part of. So they were against social transformation. They were for social status quo.
Right, right.
And that's why they shifted to the BJP from Congress.
When you talk about the decentralization of power, the way Modi took away law enforcement powers from the police, or the way he took away supervisory powers from watchdog bodies. Did you see echoes of that happening, especially in the second term of Modi at the center, and how?
Yes, we saw that indeed gradually in Gujarat, with more institutions being captured. Number one, the police. Number two, the judiciary, with one clear attempt at infiltrating the judiciary and appointing prosecutors who would come from the RSS galaxy. Other institutions, of course, shifted as well, and the bureaucracy is one of them. Gujarat cadres, IAS cadres, were promoted. Some of them have moved to Delhi, by the way. You have an amazing continuity in terms of who are the people who were there in Gujarat, who are now here in Delhi. In the case of the bureaucrats, there is something very interesting that has been unnoticed. A kind of new nexus with the business milieu. Gujarat is, of course, the place where you have the largest number of industrialists, the largest number of businessmen per capita, if you want. And the connection between the state and the business milieu have always been there. And Shriman Bhai Patel was a good example of this osmosis. Under Modi, it took a new turn. The state and only few businessmen became really in a kind of osmosis. And the promotion of some oligarchs started there. Again, a continuity. Gautam Adani started to become a very important supporter for Modi as early as 2003, when he was on the defensive, when the Confederation of Indian Industry attacked him, Mr. Godrej, Mr. Bajaj, telling him that's not what we should do in Gujarat. These riots are very bad for the state, very bad for business. So Gautam Adani came to his rescue at that time and created a group of supporters. He was paid back very soon afterwards, offered a special economic zone in Mundra for a port, and bureaucrats helped. And they helped because the state asked them to help. They helped by shifting to the private sector as well. So you have a kind of circulation of bureaucrats from the state apparatus to the private sector. That is clearly a way to capture the bureaucracy, to capture the administration. So it's not only the police, it's not only the judiciary, it's also the administration that has been transformed in the process. And even today, you have this very large number of bureaucrats used by the BJP. Well, so many of them in the government, Mr. Jaishankar in the first place, former IFS officers. And that started in Gujarat. That technique of merging two kinds of social groups, so to speak, or sociologies, was initiated in the Gujarat model, quote unquote, that was Modi's Gujarat. You have a kind of blurring of the border, the frontier between the private sphere and the state, and the state loses its autonomy in some ways. It's not a neutral referee. This is what we see today, and the Indian embassies across the world are playing a part that is ideological, for instance, not neutral. The state is not neutral anymore.
Right. Sir, recently I watched a film which was originally a 70s film, but it has now been re-released in India. It's called Manthan by Shyam Benegal. And it's a fictionalized version of the Amul story in Gujarat. And because this film is a fantasy, towards the end, we are shown that all the Dalit villagers, they sort of get together and they take control of the cooperative, and the fruits of liberalization are shared by one and all, irrespective of caste and class and so on. In reality, we know that Dr. Verghese Kurian ended up consolidating the powerful patidars of the region, because of which Amul was able to be a thing at all. But I found the nature of the fantasy very instructive indeed, because it sort of suggests that the opposite of that was happening.
Yes, the cooperative movement is very important in Gujarat. Amul is only one of many cooperatives. But I think we should use the past tense there. It was very important. The cooperative movement, first of all, played a major role in the freedom movement, giving self-help as a recipe. And it retained a lot of importance during the first decades of independent India. Congress relied a lot on the network of cooperatives. And Amit Shah realized that. In the book, I explained how and when, and started to capture these institutions one more. That was even before they took over power. It started before. It was, of course, fully accomplished after they took over power, but it was initiated before. And interestingly, the cooperatives Amit Shah was the most interested in were the banks, cooperative banks, that they finally took over from. And in the case of Amul and other cooperatives, they resisted more for a longer period. But finally, you saw that, yes, they took over also from most of them. It was part of a very significant objective. They wanted to get power at the local level, which means that they had to control the cooperatives, they had to control the municipal corporations, they had to control the panchayats as well, Janpad panchayats, district boards, and so on. And, again, this is something we see at the national level now, but we could see it at the Gujarat level then. Narendra Modi canvassed to win municipal elections. Where do you see a chief minister spending so much time to win local elections? Modi did it, realizing that he needed to have this kind of implantation at the local level. And he succeeded in winning Rajkot Municipal Corporation, 1983, Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, 1985, and at the same time, gradually, he made inroads in the villages as well. So cooperatives on the one hand, local bodies on the other hand, were part of the same plan to get really deep roots at the local level.
Right. Now, sir, you mentioned in the introduction that this book had been completed around 10 years ago, and that in the intervening 10 years, several publishers had written to you that this is not the right time to release the book. We feared that it might run into legal trouble. Did you feel a sense of poetic justice that the book's timing has sort of coincided with what seems to be the weakening of Modi's empire?
Well, I did not know that there would be any weakening when the book was finally published a couple of months ago. Well, what I feel is a relief. I've written this book over 20 years. Well, I've worked on that book over 20 years. I've been to Gujarat every year, twice, thrice, since, in fact, 2001. My first visit was after the earthquake of January 2001. And I amassed information, I gathered data for 20 years. My last visit was 2020. Now I'm really relieved that this is there for the record. And if the context, if the circumstances allow people to speak about it more than I would have anticipated, it's a bonus. And of course, another relief.
Right. So just as a parting question, I would ask you, now that Modi has a severely depleted majority and he is dependent upon regional state parties for the survival of his government, what are some of the things that the opposition, and I'm not just talking about the Congress here, but also the regional parties, what should they do to ensure that this momentum is taken forward and that Modi is finally unseated from power?
Well, first of all, they must use the parliament. Parliament was an echo chamber for many years. Incidentally, the same way the Vidhan Sabha of Gujarat was an echo chamber. The same pattern applied. The Prime Minister is never there in the Lok Sabha or Parliament. The Chief Minister Narendra Modi was not there either, and we have again a comparison to make. Now the opposition is very well represented in the Lok Sabha, and the first thing they should do is to use this institution to bring it back to what it was. You must have parliamentary committees. You must see the bills in advance. You must negotiate for amendments to be taken into account. That's the first thing. That's, I would say, in terms of modus operandi. The substance. What are you using the parliament for? Well, for promoting the issues they have raised, the opposition, during the election campaign. Inequalities, the peasants' condition, joblessness, attacks on federalism. Federalism should be back to what it was. And of course, autonomy of the institutions. The ED, the CBI, the Election Commission, all of them should be restored to their original status. It may not be sufficient. And therefore, I consider that it cannot be only in the political domain that the opposition has to work. It's also as a social movement. And it's even more important to have a vibrant civil society now, that it is exactly at that level that the Sangh Parivar has made its own inroads. Sangh Parivar is there with vigilante groups, with student unions, trade unions, peasant unions. This is the domain the opposition should invest also. And the situation is very much, I would say, conducive to that. We have had a farmers movement for many years, and it is still there, clearly. Can it be given a kind of sense of direction nationally? Similarly, we have this protest against the CA that was also almost a national protest, showing that minorities were living in fear, Muslims were living in fear in particular. How do you channelize this energy? Muslims have been taken for granted during these elections. Everybody knew that they would vote for the opposition. So why should you give them tickets? Why should you give them any recognition? Well, they need to be recognized as the main casualty of the regime. So to organize these people as well should be at the social level, probably part of the opposition's agenda. And last but not least, they should stay united. They should stay united because this is the condition for being efficient. They may because they still have a common adversary, and that helps. What we probably will see, at least what the opposition should work in, would be to bring those who are still outside of the India grouping to join this grouping. Mayawati should not be afraid as much as she was anymore. Navid Patnaik must have realized that the kind of strategy he followed was self-defeating. Well, you have few groups of that kind, few parties of that kind who are still outside, and who probably will realize that this is the only way. This is something we see everywhere. Look at Turkey. Against Erdogan, you have to bring a coalition with parties who are poles apart, who have nothing in common, except the need to dislodge the strong man from power. We've seen this in so many other parts: Poland, Hungary, Israel. So the coalition needs to be very large. It can be still larger, active in parliament, active in the street, active in the villages, and they must build a positive agenda. It should not be only against what is there. It should be for something ambitious, and the potential is there because they have a real program. Socio-economic reforms, social reforms, the caste census, among others, should be an important item in this program. And if they do that, we may see that the worst is never for sure.
Right. I hope the opposition is listening to these very wise words. Thank you so much for talking to me today, Professor. And I hope that people read this book and see the lessons that it has, not only for Gujarat, but for the rest of the country as well. Thank you so much, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya.
Frontline Conversations. Leading the debate since 1984.